Pettitt here, and we are getting ready to talk about Chapter 25, Small Business Administration. My friend Dylan stupidly agreed to read the second chapter. Why are my friends crazy? I don't know, but I'm so grateful for them. So Dylan, thank you very much for jumping in yet again to read through the Small Business Administration chapter and see where this conversation takes us. Is there a hot take you'd like to start with that's burning a hole in your pocket?
Yeah, I think for me, the hot take is that small business, uh, as defined in the United States, is way different than I thought it was going to be. So in the chapter, we're talking about small business administration, and they really define small business in America as 500 or less employees, and something like, less than like $13 million in
Right.
revenue here.
Right. And just out of curiosity, Dylan, you run a small business. How
Yeah,
many employees do you have?
five.
Five.
So,
I
yeah.
would like to point out you are like a megala corporation compared to me. I
Yeah,
have zero employees.
yeah,
And I do think that that is a very important thing to start with because they often talk about small businesses getting loans or needing different opportunities or support or something like that. But when we hear like too big to fail is so much more astronomically larger than 13 million and 500 employees that's what's too big to fail.
yeah,
500 and less is a little baby place. I am a microscopic grain of rice.
definitely. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Super. Super. So let's talk about what the Small Business Administration is and specifically what the Heritage Foundation says about it in the mandate for leadership that we know as Project 2025. Um, Stop the Coup has three main points, one of which most of the chapter is talking about, and it's really kind of a side note personal grievance that people are really mad about. So I will say Small Business Administration is not a department that I probably thought about before COVID, even as someone who's been in business with no employees. Um, if I thought about anything like Small Business Development Council, I think is the SBDC. We have an office here in town that does workshops on how to, market and things like that. Maybe I thought about that. But SBA loans came out during COVID. Some of us know them. They're different ones. Is PPP, which was preparation protection plan, something like that. Maybe
I
can't
thought people
remember.
was the payroll protection plan.
Payroll protection plan. Payroll protection plan. Those are the three P's. Good job, Dylan. EDIL is emergency disaster in Illinois. No, I don't. That's not what it stands for. EDIL was another kind of loan that came out for quote small businesses during COVID. So now I am more familiar with the SBA because I have an SBA loan that I pay off every month. Outside of that, hadn't really thought about it, didn't really know what was going on, etc. It's supposed to be an Office of Advocacy Regulatory Outreach, which, as we have seen in the early weeks of the Trump administration, anything related to advocacy and regulation and outreach is being frozen or cut. It is supposed to work with access to capital and help small businesses have access to capital. Being able entrepreneurial development programs, which I think is kind of like the SBDC thing, government contracting support, except they're really mad about how many contractors the government is supporting, and advocacy, which is, of course, a very bad word, but that's what it's supposed to do. What was your familiarity with the Small Business Administration before stupidly volunteering to read this chapter?
Well, I think similar to you, being familiar with the SBDCs that are sort of like, the regional places that do all that advocacy and like workshop stuff. And then
Mhm.
like very basic understanding of the loan programs as a small business owner, kind of having looked into them. Um, but just to like go one step back from this point, we can loop back to it is like I think an important thing that I learned about the small business and administration is that besides this stuff they do in between of like the business loans and the advocacy stuff, it really has been this like mechanism of like uh keeping the economy going during times of like crisis, right? So like, it comes out of the Great Depression called something different, then they changed the name during like the 1940 war period. And then
Mhm.
like, so when there's sort of like these like recessionary periods or whatever, SBA like pumps out the loans and everything to kind of keep the wheels turning.
Right.
So and I think it's important to understand that mechanism part of it too, in the sense of, you know, why are they in this chapter making a push to make sure all the loans are private now, things like that. So,
Right.
yeah.
Disaster, emergency, depression kind of relief for quote unquote small businesses. During the Obama administration, it came merged with the Department of Commerce, and
Mhm.
then occasionally it is its own place. So this kind of like shrink dink happens with the Department of Commerce based on who's in office. Yeah, but I think that brings up a really good point. The 3 points that Stop the Coup 2025, thank you again for your summaries, said uh, number one is supercharge the SBA Office of Advocacy to reduce regulations for small businesses. So I would like to use this as a great example of one of those hypocritical loops that we are finding in multiple chapters. We're going to reduce the regulations to be better for small businesses, except we are also unilaterally getting rid of all the offices of advocacy.
And I and this is also a good point to that small business thing, right? We're going to reduce regulations for small businesses, which could include a giant, manufacturing plant right next to a river with 500 employees, right? So reducing environmental regulations, whatever, and
Right,
what's for small businesses.
right. Not a therapy office with
Yeah.
five different therapists.
Or
Right, right,
not
right.
the popsicle shop on the corner that's like literally your grandma for the last 40 years.
Right, exactly. Allow religious organizations to receive certain SBA loans. Currently, federal loans, because we separate church and state, or at least we used to try. The religious organizations are now eligible based on the Heritage Foundation recommendations. Not currently eligible, but haven't watched the news today. For religious organizations to be able to receive SBA loans, so this would be like churches, religious non-accredited organizations, education centers, etc. However, it only means Protestant Christian. It doesn't mean Catholic, it doesn't mean Jewish, it doesn't mean Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, it doesn't mean any other religious organization, but just Protestant, primarily white Protestant organizations would be able to take federal loans, which is really the only kind of federal loans they want to support are going to white upper class business people.
Are you
Um,
being inflammatory or did you find that in the footnotes?
well, there are hardly any footnotes in the entire document. But not inflammatory. I'm finding it to be a consistent theme.
I know. I agree with you, but
Mm,
it's just like
I know. I'm just pissing people off.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not the last chapter, but it is the last one we're recording, which is why I'm a little giddy. Okay, so then I'm trying really hard to pay attention to everything else that is mentioned in the chapter, which is some other things before we get super gossipy. So
Oh,
one thing. Oh, go ahead.
go for it. Sorry, I didn't mean to
I
interrupt
was
you.
going to talk about the Establishment Clause. Is that what you're going to talk about?
The which clause?
The Establishment Clause of the First
Um,
Amendment of the United States.
no, you go for it.
All right. So the Establishment Clause, this is named in the chapter of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, prohibits the government from establishing a religion or favoring one religion over another. This came up in the religious exclusions.
Mhm.
So if the Establishment Clause applies only to the federal government, the Supreme Court has interpreted the clause in several ways, including what is referred to as the Lemon Test. The government can assist religion if the assistance primary purpose is secular, the assistance doesn't promote or inhibit religion, and there's no excessive entanglement between church and state. So getting federal funding during a disaster or an emergency, they're saying is would pass the lemon test. There's the coercion test, where government action violates the Establishment Clause if it provides direct aid to religion that would establish a state church, or coerces people to support or participate in a religion against their will, which is the clause that doing things against their religious benefits or religious beliefs. That is the government breaking it by mandating that you have to like not discriminate against gay people, et cetera, et cetera. That's coercion. And then legal coercion is the Establishment Clause is violated only by legal coercion, such as force of law or threat of penalty. So this is religious establishments could receive fees or fines, legal penalties for doing things that are entangle themselves with the church and state. That's what they want to undo, those regulations. So that I want to throw in because it like shouts out to the Establishment Clause, but doesn't even use it correctly in the chapter. And in figuring out what is the Establishment Clause, because I didn't know, it seems convenient when they need it, and then they ignore it when it's not convenient. What were you going to say if it wasn't about that amazing little bit?
Oh, I was just gonna bring up the without using the DEI language, they're discussed with with SBDCs providing like population specific support, right? So like
Katrina.
women's work, like women small business owners, Black business owners that all sort of like services need to move to a first come, first serve model. So sort of that they don't use the DEI language in the chapter, but it's clearly another place where they're making sure that uh nobody's getting anything extra.
Yeah, what I love in how the judgments and assumptions and just bias related, which you started naming, it cites Katrina as the example, as one of many examples where I feel like you can hear the implied they, right? Like I'm using my hand pointing out for people who are washing their dishes because the mismanagement, abuse, waste, and fraud, right? So, like, that typically is racist and classist. Mission creep and general enlargement, which is how, like, incorporating climate work, but
Mhm.
also I think the idea of LGBT and gender specific is this kind of like copious enlargement of responsibility doesn't make sense because to them it is a very mutable identity, so that's the enlargement piece. It goes straight for voter agencies, pilot programs, and direct government lending, and that
Mhm.
during a conservative administration we don't need to do any of those things, and the country runs just fine, and it's only liberal administrations that do those things, which by the way is totally not true. I mean, it has been running similarly regardless of who's been president for decades. It talks more about religious exclusions. It does talk about small business innovation research and small business technology transfer programs, which all again fall under that kind of research development budget, which are, say it with me, being cut and slashed because we don't need to do any more research or development. We've learned enough. We just need to go back to the basics and not do any more of this like new innovation-y stuff. But out the other side of their mouth, to be pro business, you would be pro innovation, but
Mhm.
only certain people. Um, that talks a little bit about private venture capital, private equity funds. Those things need to be supported. And then it does also make a suggestion of creating a new business demarcation for medium sized enterprises, which would be 501 employees up to, it doesn't state, but smaller than ginormous global too big to fails.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an example of like the people who are writing these chapters not really having a super intimate knowledge, I think, because that phrase they use, the small, medium size businesses or whatever, I mean, I think that's actually like a real term that means something outside of the Heritage Foundation. And so
Yeah,
the way they're using it from my little research is like actually not super accurate. So
right.
I think what they're talking about is creating a whole new thing that doesn't actually make sense. Like what is a yeah, in the rest of the world, a medium-sized business is like 200 employees. So, uh, yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's
I think overall the chapter is really mirroring what we're seeing in a lot of other places, just that consolidation of power, kind of going to the bit like mainstream American business model of a CEO having control over everything, consolidating programs, making sure that everything's quote unquote fair, and that there's no waste happening.
right.
And then moving sort of these mechanisms of the government, so federal loaning into the private sector. So really pushing for the lending to come from the private sector, which uh, we'll have less protections for people who need them.
Less protections because who needs them? And I would like to say that we have spent at least a solid 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more, talking about the content of the chapter, which is hidden inside of a very pithy argument about Planned Parenthood, right? But look, did you see what we did? We talked about everything else, all 8 sentences that had some other content. So turns out I did a bunch of research on this. So each individual Planned Parenthood clinic has enough employees that their local banks approved them for EDIL loans during COVID to be able to, for the payroll protection before the PPP came out. So it was all EDIL still. But each individual Planned Parenthood site was like, no, 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 no. This is a very bad idea. Trump is president. COVID is happening. We cannot take out an EDIL loan. They're going to freak out that the federal government is supporting Planned Parenthood. Like, we can't do this. And banks got it pre-approved by the federal government under the Trump administration during COVID that each individual clinic could receive this money because it was a disaster and it was health relief. And now they real mad about it. They real mad that they used federal funds to support Planned Parenthood. And so now they are saying that Planned Parenthood committed fraud and should not have received those loans. And 2/3 of the chapter is dedicated to Planned Parenthood and its nefarious motivations to steal federal funding in the middle of a global pandemic. Did I summarize that nicely?
Yeah, I mean, I think what a lot of people don't understand about Planned Parenthood is it has this like affiliate structure, almost similar to a franchise. And so,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's you might know more about the affiliate structure, how it actually works, but the way I think about it is a franchise. And so, uh,
Spot on.
like, well, it's a national brand. It's similar to Burger King, and where like every clinic operates its own, so its own sort of thing. Like, you know, millions and millions of dollars aren't pouring into your local Planned Parenthood clinic from like national.
No, and if we are talking about EDIL or PPP fraud, there are a lot of people who are very wealthy who received very large loans during COVID. And Planned Parenthood actually is providing health services, got pre approved, and made the banks go through a second tier of approval before they even took it because they knew politically it would be dangerous. But like other chapters, what a great opportunity to clear off the post it notes of your desk of the things that have pissed you off and staple them together and call it the mandate for leadership.
Mhm.
Pretty much. I really have nothing else to say about the chapter. Do you have anything else to say about the chapter?
No, I was like kind of disappointed as a small business owner. I thought there was gonna be something in there that was gonna make me like I was gonna be like, look, I'm gonna be a capitalist now. But I think that it's just more of the same as I mentioned, about
Yeah.
consolidating power and making sure the haves have more. So
Mhm.
that's what I got on
I
it.
would I would highly recommend reading. Don't do that. Watch the video on the Department of Labor because
Mhm.
it does talk about like overtime and benefits and insurance and things like that. That as small business owners, we need to know much more about what changes are happening. So I highly recommend heading over to the Department of Labor video, which I think is already up on the playlist. Um, Dylan, if regular humans are thinking about the Small Business Administration, uh, if you own a small business, first off, high five for those of us that have less than 500 employees. I have 0 employees. If you did take out an SBA loan during COVID, don't forget you're going to have to pay that back. And like you can set it all up and auto payments, etc. It's a very low interest rate, but If you read the fine print on the loans, like they'll come for your property if you default on that loan. So don't forget to pay that off. Otherwise, if you live somewhere, I think it's really important to notice that small businesses, to your point of like the grandma at the farmer's market, small businesses that have less than 500 employees aren't even actually discussed or talked about in the Small Business Administration. And so if you are, we live in a very small town. So if we are supporting local businesses, most of the local businesses here don't have 500 employees. And I think that that's when we talk about buying local, we need to be really mindful that these organizations are so small that they don't even show up on the radar screen of governmental support. So buy local and support your local businesses through this administration. That would be my biggest suggestion. Do you have any suggestions?
No, I would just really echo that. I think we have been talking about buying local for so long, but I think right now is really the point where we need to get really serious about that if we want our communities to continue to survive and thrive,
Yeah.
right? Starting
Yeah.
with is
I went grocery shopping yesterday and I told my partner we need a chicken egg hookup, and not just because of the price of eggs. I mean, I didn't notice the price of eggs was that much higher than typical, but there weren't many, and there was a carton of egg like a cap that you could buy because supply is off because of bird flu, not because of pricing. Um, I need an egg hookup if you know anybody. Um, all right. Well, that is the world's shortest chapter because it was mostly just bitching about the Planned Parenthood, but we did talk about some other things. Dylan, thank you again for volunteering to do a second chapter. And best of luck out there, y'all. It's been a year in a week or two. And small business owners, we feel you. Go to your Chamber of Commerce receptions and events. Try to build community and support yourselves and try and stay in business. We're here for you.